Welcome to my Chanel Real Story Hub. Today's story from Iran. This man ruled the world in the heart of Iran, in the city of Mashhad. A boy was born on the 17th of July 1939, who would one day rise to lead the Islamic Republic through decades of turbulence, war, and global scrutiny. His name was Ali Khamenei, a child of a modest clerical household. His father, Sayyid Javad Hosseini Khamenei, was a religious scholar of limited means. The family lived in simple conditions, often struggling to make ends meet. Their house small and unadorned, their lives marked by humility. Ali grew up surrounded by books, scripture, and the austere lifestyle that accompanied his father's standing in the Shia clerical tradition. In those early years, there was no indication that this child would one day become the central figure of Iran's political and religious life. But the seeds of discipline and devotion were quietly being sown. Mashhad, one of Iran's most sacred cities, home to the shrine of Imam Reza, played a powerful role in shaping the young Ali's worldview. Pilgrims came from across the country and beyond, carrying stories, prayers, and grievances. The atmosphere was thick with religious devotion, but also with the discontent of ordinary Iranians living under the rule of the Pahlavi monarchy. The contrast between faith and repression, between poverty and power, left a mark on the boy's developing mind. From a young age, Ali was exposed to the struggles of the poor and the sharp disparities of Iranian society. His education began at home under his father's guidance, and later he studied at traditional Islamic seminaries in Mashhad. Ali was drawn not only to the recitation of scripture, but also to the stories of resistance and sacrifice within Shia Islam, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the defiance at Karbala, the sense of duty against tyranny. These were more than theological lessons. They were narratives that resonated with the frustration simmering in mid-20th century Iran. In his teenage years, Khamenei immersed himself in religious studies with remarkable dedication. He attended the seminary in Qom, Iran's intellectual and spiritual hub, where he was taught by some of the most influential clerics of his generation, including the man who would later change his life, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Khamenei was deeply influenced by Khomeini's fiery sermons against the monarchy, sermons that questioned the Shah's westernizing reforms, the loss of Islamic traditions, and the growing dominance of foreign powers in Iran's affairs. These were dangerous ideas to embrace, but for young students like Khamenei, they offered a vision of resistance and purpose. The Iran of the 1950s and 60s was a land in transition. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, pushed forward ambitious modernization programs under the White Revolution, expanding education, land reform, and women's rights. Yet the changes came with heavy political repression. Opposition voices were silenced, clerics were sidelined, and the secret police, Savek, grew notorious for their surveillance and brutal crackdowns. It was in this climate that Khamenei began to quietly take part in political activities. He delivered speeches in mosques, criticized the monarchy's corruption, and circulated writings that challenged the Shah's narrative. These acts did not go unnoticed. By the early 1960s, Khamenei was fully aligned with Khomeini's opposition movement. When Khamenei openly condemned the Shah in 1963 and was subsequently arrested, protests erupted across the country. Demonstrations were crushed violently, leaving hundreds dead. For Khamenei and his fellow clerical students, it was a formative moment. They saw the cost of resistance, but also the power of collective defiance. Khamenei himself was arrested several times in the following years, enduring prison cells and interrogations that sought to break his resolve. Yet each experience seemed only to deepen his conviction that Iran's destiny lay not with the Shah, but with an Islamic government rooted in justice and independence. During his imprisonments, Khamenei spent hours in solitary confinement, denied books and writing materials. But he memorized scripture, reflected on strategy, and sharpened his understanding of what was at stake. Friends and fellow activists later recalled how unyielding he was, how even after release he would return to his work with quiet determination. Unlike some who broke under SAVAK's pressure, Khamenei emerged each time more resolved. His family, meanwhile, lived under constant fear of harassment, their home raided, their privacy shattered. Yet they too bore the cost of his commitment. As the 1970s unfolded, Iran became increasingly unstable. Oil revenues fueled rapid modernization, but the wealth gap grew wider. Discontent simmered in bazaars, universities, and seminaries. Khamenei moved carefully, building networks among religious students and community leaders. He translated works of Islamic thinkers, introducing Iranian audiences to ideas of governance and resistance shaped by figures from Egypt and elsewhere in the Muslim world. These translations and lectures helped expand the intellectual foundation of the movement. By 1975, repression was at its peak. Political parties were banned, dissent was ruthlessly silenced, and the Shah declared a one-party state under his Rastakhiz party. But beneath the surface, opposition networks thrived. Clerics, activists, and intellectuals maintained secret communication, distributing pamphlets and recordings of Khomeini's speeches from exile in Najaf. Khamenei was a key figure in this underground effort, ensuring that the message of resistance continued to reach ordinary Iranians. The turning point came in 1978. Demonstrations erupted after the government attacked Khomeini in the press, accusing him of foreign ties. Protesters filled the streets in city after city, demanding the end of the Shah's rule. Each attempt at suppression only fueled further outrage. By autumn, the movement had become unstoppable. Khamenei, despite repeated arrests, was at the forefront of mobilizing resistance in Mashhad and beyond. The mosques became centers of organization, sermons became rallying cries, and the once feared regime began to crumble under the weight of its own brutality. In February 1979, the Shah fled the country, and Khomeini returned from exile to a hero's welcome. Millions lined the streets of Tehran to greet him, their chants echoing through the capital. It was the climax of a revolution decades in the making. For Khamenei, it was the moment when faith and politics merged into a single reality. He was no longer just a cleric or an activist. He was now part of a revolutionary leadership tasked with building a new order. In the early days of the Islamic Republic, Khamenei was given key responsibilities. He became a member of the Revolutionary Council, working closely with Khomeini and other clerics to shape the foundations of the new state. The air was filled with both euphoria and uncertainty. Old institutions collapsed, new ones emerged, and the challenge of governance loomed large. For the revolutionaries, it was not enough to remove the Shah. They had to build a system that reflected Islamic principles while defending the country against both internal and external enemies. Khamenei soon became a target for those enemies. In June 1981, during a period of intense political conflict, he survived an assassination attempt while delivering a speech in Tehran. A bomb exploded, severely injuring him. His right hand was permanently damaged, leaving him unable to perform simple tasks without difficulty. But he survived, and his survival only elevated his standing among supporters, who saw in him the image of a leader scarred by sacrifice. The attack underscored the violent struggles of those years, as rival factions, foreign powers, and internal dissent threatened to tear the fledgling republic apart. The early 1980s also brought war. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, beginning an 8-year conflict that would devastate both nations. Khamenei played a critical role during this period, serving as president of Iran from 1981 to 1989. Although the presidency was not the most powerful office in the Islamic Republic, Khamenei used the position to strengthen the state during the war, to rally the people, and to ensure that the Islamic Revolution did not falter under the weight of foreign invasion. He visited front lines, encouraged soldiers, and maintained close communication with Khamenei, who remained the ultimate authority as supreme leader. The war years were brutal. Cities were bombed, young men were sent to the front in waves, and the nation endured economic collapse. Yet the government portrayed the conflict as a sacred defense, a test of faith and endurance. Khamenei's speeches reflected this tone, blending religious devotion with political resolve. He argued that Iran was not just defending territory, but defending the essence of the revolution itself. For many, these words were a source of resilience. For others, they were reminders of the enormous sacrifices demanded by the state. Despite the hardship, Khamenei's influence grew. He became known not just as a politician, but as a figure of continuity and loyalty to Khomeini's vision. While other clerics debated or pursued personal influence, Khamenei maintained a reputation for discipline and alignment with the supreme leader. He was part of a small inner circle that Khamenei trusted, a group that would become decisive in shaping Iran's future after the Imam's death. By the late 1980s, the Islamic Republic faced a crossroads. The war with Iraq finally ended in 1988, leaving the country exhausted but intact. Khomeini's health was failing, and questions about succession became unavoidable. The position of supreme leader, the highest authority in Iran's unique system of governance, required a figure who could command respect among clerics, the military, and the people. Khamenei, though not the most senior in terms of clerical rank, had qualities that set him apart: loyalty, resilience, and a proven record of survival in some of the Republic's darkest hours. As the nation waited, the question of who would lead after Khamenei grew heavier by the day. Behind closed doors, political maneuvering intensified. For Ali Khamenei, the decades of struggle, from his humble beginnings in Mashhad to his imprisonment under the Shah, from the revolution to the presidency, from surviving assassination to guiding the nation through war, had prepared him for a role he could not yet claim. The final chapter of Khomeini's life was approaching, and with it, the decisive moment that would propel Khamenei into history. And it was here, on the eve of that transition, that the cleric from Mashhad stood on the threshold of supreme power, awaiting the death of a mentor who had shaped his destiny, and the call of a nation that would soon look to him for leadership. In June 1989, the Islamic Republic of Iran entered its most uncertain moment since the revolution. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the towering figure who had led the uprising against the Shah and built the foundations of the new order, passed away after a long illness. The loss plunged the nation into mourning, millions flooding the streets to pay their respects. But beneath the grief lay a deeper anxiety. Who could possibly succeed him? The Constitution required the supreme leader to be a Maria, a senior clerical authority of the highest rank. Yet none seemed to possess the same combination of charisma, religious standing, and revolutionary legitimacy as Khomeini. It was in this moment of uncertainty that the assembly of experts convened. Names were debated, alliances tested, and doubts aired. Among the possible successors, Ali Khamenei was not the obvious choice. At the time, he was only in his late 40s, relatively young in the hierarchy of clerical leadership, and not a Maria in the traditional sense. Yet he had qualities that mattered in politics more than in theology: loyalty to Khomeini, proven resilience in the face of danger, and the ability to command the trust of key revolutionary institutions, particularly the Revolutionary Guard. Behind closed doors, a dramatic debate unfolded. Some favored a council of leadership instead of a single man, fearing no one could carry Khomeini's mantle. But ultimately, the balance tilted toward Khamenei. His reputation as a survivor of assassination, a veteran of the revolution, and a figure who had stood firm during the war years lent him credibility. On June 4, 1989, the assembly announced that Ali Khamenei would become the new supreme leader of Iran. For many inside and outside the country, it was a surprising choice. For Khamenei himself, it was a moment of destiny. From the very beginning, Khamenei's leadership faced enormous challenges. Domestically, the country was exhausted from 8 years of war with Iraq. The economy was shattered, infrastructure lay in ruins, and a generation of young Iranians carried the scars of conflict. Internationally, Iran was isolated, its revolution feared by neighbors and opposed by Western powers. Khamenei's task was not only to preserve the system Khomeini had built, but to consolidate his own authority in a landscape where many doubted his clerical rank and political strength. He moved cautiously but firmly. In the early 1990s, Khamenei worked to strengthen the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij militia, ensuring the military backbone of the republic remained loyal to him personally. He also placed trusted allies in key institutions, building a network of influence that reached across the judiciary, state media, and religious foundations. Though he lacked the scholarly prestige of senior clerics in Qom, he compensated with political acumen, presenting himself as the guardian of the revolution rather than a theological giant. The Iran of the 1990s entered a period of reconstruction under President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who sought to rebuild the economy and normalize relations with neighbors. Khamenei supported these efforts to an extent, but always within the boundaries of revolutionary principles. He kept a close watch to ensure economic reforms did not undermine the ideological foundations of the state. To the outside world, this was a time when Iran seemed to be cautiously opening, yet at home, the supreme leader's hand remained steady on the levers of power. But cracks soon appeared. The 1997 election of Mohammad Khatami brought a wave of optimism and demands for reform. Khatami's promises of dialogue among civilizations, political openness, and social freedoms captured the imagination of Iran's youth. For a brief moment, Tehran's streets buzzed with hope. Yet for Khamenei, reform posed a danger. Too much openness, he feared, would weaken the Islamic system and invite Western influence. While allowing limited space for debate, he quietly used the judiciary, security forces, and state media to curtail the reform movement. Newspapers were closed, activists were jailed, and the reformist tide slowly ebbed. By the early 2000s, Khatami's presidency had lost momentum, and Khamenei's authority remained intact. Meanwhile, beyond Iran's borders, the world was changing rapidly. The attacks of September 11, 2001, and the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and later Iraq placed Iran in a dramatically altered strategic environment. With American forces on both its eastern and western borders, the Islamic Republic faced existential pressure. Yet this pressure also created opportunities. The collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq removed a bitter enemy, and the power vacuum allowed Iran to extend its influence through allies and militias. Khamenei watched closely as Iran's regional position shifted from isolated revolutionary state to a key player in Middle Eastern geopolitics. Nuclear program became the next great battlefield. For Khamenei, nuclear development symbolized national pride, scientific progress, and independence from Western domination. For the West, it was a potential threat that had to be contained. Negotiations, sanctions, and covert operations marked the years that followed. Assassinations of Iranian scientists, cyber attacks on nuclear facilities, and waves of economic sanctions strained the nation. Khamenei remained defiant, insisting that Iran's intentions were peaceful but refusing to bow to foreign pressure. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a hardline populist, rose to the presidency. With fiery rhetoric and a confrontational stance toward the West, Ahmadinejad's style resonated with Khamenei's emphasis on resistance, though their relationship was not without tension. During these years, Iran's posture hardened, its regional reach extended, and its defiance of the United States and Israel grew sharper. Yet at home, economic mismanagement and rising sanctions deepened public frustration. The 2009 presidential election marked one of the most dangerous moments of Khamenei's rule. When Ahmadinejad was declared the winner in a contest many believed had been rigged, millions poured into the streets in what became known as the Green Movement. The protests shook the republic to its core, chanting slogans that questioned not only the election, but the very authority of the supreme leader himself. For weeks, the world watched as Tehran became a theater of defiance and repression. Khamenei took a firm stance, warning protesters that continued resistance would not be tolerated. Security forces cracked down, arrests mounted, and the movement was crushed. The episode demonstrated the limits of dissent in the Islamic Republic, but it also revealed the vulnerability of the state to its own citizens' demands for change. In the following decade, Iran's fortunes ebbed and flowed. Under President Hassan Rouhani, Iran signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015, an agreement with world powers that limited its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. The deal brought a brief period of economic optimism, yet Khamenei remained cautious, warning that the United States could not be trusted. His warnings proved prescient when, in 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement, reimposing harsh sanctions. Iran's economy once again faltered, inflation soared, and ordinary Iranians bore the brunt of the struggle. Throughout these years, Khamenei's image evolved. To supporters, he became the symbol of resistance, the leader who had kept Iran independent despite enormous pressure. To critics, he represented rigidity, a refusal to adapt, and the embodiment of an unelected authority that overshadowed the will of the people. His speeches, often filled with references to faith, sacrifice, and steadfastness, reflected the duality of his role, a religious figure who framed politics as a continuation of a spiritual mission. In the region, Iran's role expanded dramatically. From Lebanon to Syria, Iraq to Yemen, the Islamic Republic projected influence through a network of allies and militias. Khamenei oversaw a strategy that sought to counter US and Israeli power by building what Iranian leaders called the Axis of Resistance. These alliances came at a cost, fueling regional conflicts and deepening Iran's isolation. But they also gave Tehran leverage that it had never possessed before. The final years of the 2010s brought new waves of unrest at home. Economic hardship, corruption, and political repression led to widespread protests in 2017, 2019, and beyond. Each time, the government responded with force, determined to prevent any movement from growing into another revolution. Khamenei's message remained consistent: resistance to foreign enemies, unity at home, and rejection of what he described as Western plots. Yet beneath the surface, discontent simmered, particularly among the younger generations who had little memory of the 1979 revolution but lived daily with its consequences. In January 2020, a dramatic event shook Iran and the world. Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds Force and one of Khamenei's closest allies, was killed in a US drone strike in Baghdad. For Khamenei, it was both a personal and strategic loss. He wept openly at Soleimani's funeral, an unusual display that reflected the depth of their bond. The assassination intensified Iran's confrontation with the United States, pushing the region closer to open conflict. Yet once again, Khamenei framed the moment as proof of Iran's sacrifices in the struggle against foreign domination. As the 2020s unfolded, Iran continued to navigate crisis after crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the weaknesses of its healthcare system and the burden of sanctions. Protests over economic conditions and women's rights erupted repeatedly, including the mass demonstrations sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022. These protests were some of the most widespread since 2009, fueled by anger over social restrictions, economic despair, and demands for freedom. Khamenei responded with firmness, blaming foreign enemies for stoking unrest and warning that the Islamic Republic would not be overthrown. Yet the sheer scale of the protests revealed the growing divide between the leadership and much of the population. By 2025, Ali Khamenei remained the central figure in Iran's political and religious life, more than 3 decades after assuming the role of supreme leader. His rule had spanned generations, wars, revolutions, and shifting global landscapes. He had survived assassination attempts, economic collapse, and challenges both from within and beyond Iran's borders. Under his watch, the Islamic Republic had endured, neither collapsing nor transforming into the liberal democracy its critics demanded. To his followers, Khamenei embodied the resilience of a nation that had stood against empires and refused to bow to outside pressure. To his opponents, he symbolized the rigidity of an authoritarian system that silenced dissent and sacrificed the aspirations of its people for the sake of ideology. In the end, his legacy was one of survival, a man born in the modest alleys of Mashhad who rose, against the expectations of many, to hold absolute power for more than 3 decades. And as Iran moved deeper into the 21st century, one question remained unresolved. The same question that had haunted the Republic since 1989. Who would come after him? And what future awaited the nation once the long shadow of Ali Khamenei finally lifted?